Good morning from Beijing to our Faith Video audience. Today we are very happy to have this precious opportunity to interview Professor Emily Tucker and her husband John Green. Both are professors at Yale University in the US. Together, they have established the Yale Forum on Religion and Ecology. Over the past several decades, through their researching, writing, lecturing, and even traveling, they are dedicating themselves to work for the peace of the world and also the environmental protection. For this reason, it is a great opportunity for us to learn from them and to share some of our concerns with these two distinguished experts. So, without further ado, my first question to both professors is, as I understand, for almost 35 some years, you studied under Father Thomas Berry, a Passionist priest who was an ecologist, philosopher. And now you are passionate about spreading his ideas, his philosophy, and also even his spirituality. First of all, can you tell us something about your experience with this great priest?
Thomas Berry was indeed an unusual person, and almost everyone who met him felt that. He was charismatic in a quiet way, profoundly spiritual. He had studied all of the world's religions and had a library of 10,000 books in his center in Riverdale. It was remarkable. And as you know, he had a great love for China. He came here in 48-49 with Ted DeBerry, and he studied Chinese language and culture, and he became particularly interested in Confucianism. So his career, maybe John will talk about his time at Fordham, where he taught in world religions, and then he moved towards this notion that we need a new story, an evolutionary story.
Oh, great.
It was Thomas Berry's journey, I believe, that gave him the resilience and the capacity to undertake the work that he did. He early on comes from a rural part of the United States, from North Carolina, and he had this dream early on of going to China, and he found he was a brooding kind of person, a thoughtful, quiet youth, and he would laughingly say, because I was brooding and thinking so much, I knew that I had to be in solitude. And I thought, where will I find that? Well, in prison or in the monastery. So he would jokingly say he joined the monastery, the Passionists, because they're not only contemplative, but also engage the world with retreats.
Wonderful.
So he had his travels to China, as Mary Evelyn has mentioned. And when he returned, part of his own spiritual struggle surfaced because he wanted to teach, and his order did not understand. He had received a doctoral degree from Catholic University. He had been to Germany after the China experience as a chaplain. So his sense of the Western world and of the East Asian world, he taught himself Sanskrits and the South Asian world. So eventually the order did give him permission. But it was a struggle, and he came to an understanding then of history of religions, and he started a magnificent program at Fordham University where we studied the variety of traditions, and his idea was students should know the scriptures of all of the major traditions and then drill down deeply, do language studies, and have a specialty, but know widely. And that kind of training that we received from him was invaluable. And it's the stepping stone for our lifetime collaboration, both during his lifetime and then we continued, as you said, to try and tell people about his ideas and his thought.
You inherited his legacy. Not only that, you want to enlarge it.
Yes.
You want to spread it.
Yes.
That's wonderful and fascinating.
And some of his earliest books, just to pick up John's point, were on Buddhism and on religions of India. And we actually met while I was studying Sanskrit that Thomas Berry taught me over the summer. And then
you met at the school?
At Fordham University.
Okay.
I had been in Japan studying and traveled all through Asia, but I came back in 75, especially to meet Thomas Berry. And all that summer, he taught me Sanskrit and the religions of India. And then in September, I was studying it, and he came, and I said, this is also a very special person. So,
can we say Father Berry was like a goopy toompi?
yes.
Matchmaker. Huh?
Matchmaker.
He also married us.
Oh, wonderful. So he has to be that person. Actually, he had gone beyond that role.
Yes.
Beyond that role.
Our teacher, our wisdom keeper, and our friend.
Wonderful. Good. What you shared about Father Thomas Berry reminds me of Thomas Merton.
Yes.
He was a contemplative, but also later on he engaged himself actively in interreligious dialogue and writing, preaching. But today we don't have time for Thomas Merton.
Mm-hmm.
We have to talk about another great figure who influenced Father Thomas Berry. Of course, now he is also influencing thousands of people, including me. This person is nobody else but Father Teilhard de Chardin, who lived on this very land for 23 years, also in Beijing. So my understanding may be limited, but at least this point I know, Father Thomas Berry owes a great deal to Father Teilhard de Chardin. Is that correct?
That's correct. Some people think that Thomas Berry might have met Pierre Teilhard de Chardin when he was in New York, but that did not happen. So they did overlap for a period of time.
No time to meet.
They didn't meet in New York, yeah.
But the influence was huge.
Excellent, that's right.
And the influence was such that Thomas Berry began to appreciate the depths of evolutionary time. We like to say deep time, because Teilhard was a paleontologist, studied the fossil record, and helped us to see the human emergence over time. So but Teilhard also, as you know, understood evolution with its spiritual and its material side.
That's right.
Almost like qi, matter, energy
qi.
For the Chinese. But Thomas Berry picked up this depth of a sacred universe from Teilhard de Chardin.
Wonderful, wonderful.
In 1964, Thomas Berry he delivered a paper, an essay that he had written called Threshold of the Modern World. And he delivered that paper at a Teilhard conference at Fordham University. There was no American Teilhard Association yet. That began in 1967. But those attending that conference, they saw that Thomas Berry had a unique understanding of Teilhard's thought, especially the idea of threshold as crossing into new territory. So Teilhard has a very interesting perspective on what is now called emergence. That in the emergence of the universe and in life on this earth, new things creative and novel creations have come forward. And Teilhard, in his paleontological work, was very keyed in on the whole idea of threshold, new emergence, new ideas and new forms of life, especially in the human community. So Thomas Berry in the 60s, he turned significantly towards the thought of Teilhard de Chardin.
And one of the most important influences, because we could talk for a long time about Teilhard and his significance, but what Thomas Berry picked up was we must tell this story of evolution as a new story, as an understanding that we have the scientific telling of evolution, but we also have a spiritual understanding of its meaning.
Correct.
And that we, as Teilhard said, the phenomenon of the human is within these processes. So in 1978, Thomas Berry wrote a single important essay called The New Story.
New Story.
And in that, he said we needed to combine evolution with a sense of its spiritual meaning. And then after 10 years with working with Brian Swim, a cosmologist, scientist, he wrote The Universe Story. And then 20 years later, Brian and I wrote The Journey of the Universe. And John and Brian and I made the film, The Journey of the Universe, all from this great vision of Teilhard de Chardin and Thomas Berry.
Great.
So Thomas Berry, he taught at Fordham University, but the Passionists also gave to him a lovely 4-story house on the Hudson River next to the Passionist Retreat House. So he turned that into the Riverdale Center for Religious Studies.
Right.
And that center then is where so many of us students would come and have wonderful meals and have lengthy conversations. And quite often during those conversations, Thomas Berry would give his shorthand understanding of Teilhard. And the shorthand understanding was he appreciated Teilhard's anthropology, Teilhard's cosmology, and Teilhard's theology. Mm-hmm. And what he meant by that was Teilhard had a sense of the anthropos, the human,
yes,
that was different than the science of his day. Because
Correct.
the human was seen as a anomalous or something that was outside of the mainstream of evolution because of our reflective consciousness, our capacity to think. And so the science community, perhaps even to this day, the human is still considered separate. But for Teilhard, he wanted to see the human in the mainstream. His anthropology was that our consciousness is a part of the consciousness in the universe.
Exactly.
So then his theology, God is not apart in some transcendent realm. The divine is in this process. And his cosmology is a cosmogenesis. The universe is not something that was created and finished back at a beginning. It's an ongoing cosmology, ongoing cosmogenesis.
Great. But this, as far as I have watched some videos, read some articles by Father Thomas Berry, at a certain point, he was also a little bit critical about Father Teilhard de Chardin.
Yes.
Which is not negative. It's kind of positive contribution to Father Teilhard de Chardin's thoughts, ideas. So, but I haven't totally grasped his development, his new insights based on his understanding of Father Teilhard de Chardin. What contribution or insights can you share with us? What new insights, new developments that Thomas Berry put into this Teilhard de Chardin's philosophy and spirituality?
That's an excellent question.
I think there's 2 points I'd like to underscore. And this is important, isn't it? That great figures can still be reconfigured for modern purposes.
That's development.
Yes. So while Berry had an immense appreciation, he also realized that Teilhard was perhaps overly optimistic. About our future, about the human building the future. Yeah. And he didn't fully grasp, because of his times, the environmental problems that were already emerging.
Yes.
So Thomas Berry's correction, if you will, was a cautionary note that human pride or hubris has got to be contained, and that we've got to work within these processes. So that was one point of the optimism of Teilhard, over-optimism perhaps. But at the same point, we all love Teilhard's zest for life and his hopeful vision.
Exactly.
The other thing about Teilhard was, for all of his time here in China, he didn't fully appreciate the Chinese traditions of Confucianism and Taoism and Buddhism, and in large measure because even today, these traditions have not been fully translated into other languages and so on. So his accessibility through French was very limited. But the appreciation for these traditions, which really developed after the Second Vatican Council, needs to go forward even further. So those are two limits of Teilhard, I would say.
Okay, thank you very much. That's great.
Yeah, and I would just add to Mary Evelyn's emphasizing the over-optimism, that it expresses itself in Teilhard, especially in his attitude towards technology. That his sense, for example, of nuclear energy or of the possibilities of genetic engineering, that Teilhard felt those dimensions of human creativity or of human search were an indication of the ongoing progress. So he didn't have good conversation partners. Remember, Teilhard was himself limited by the church in the individuals that he could speak with, or the pushback against his writings. He didn't have good conversation partners. So sometimes the darker side of some of these dimensions he didn't see clearly.
Great. But with that point in our mind, now we come to our time. Because we are talking the Amazonian, Pan-Amazonian Synod of Bishops is going on in Rome. And this Synod of Bishops has a particular attention and emphasis on ecology and the environmental crisis, not only in Pan-Amazon region, actually also throughout the world. So as lay faithful, you are not in this Synod, but as I understand, you were in the preparation committee, at least to a certain degree, for this ongoing Synod of Bishops. Now, from your perspective, what suggestions and what insights you would like to offer to the Synod Fathers sitting in that meeting hall?
Yeah. I went to one preparatory conference at Georgetown for this, so I wasn't involved more than that, but I am very appreciative of what is happening. That conference was excellent, and I think this is a historic synod, isn't it? Great. Absolutely historic. And why? Because it's the first synod on a bioregion with the attention to one of the most important and precious resources or sources of life around the world, namely the Amazon and all of its biological diversity and so on, but also its people. And this is why, through Laudato Si, of course, in 2015, that the Pope announced this integral ecology for people and the planet. It's so crucial. It's so beautifully done. And I think just to conclude here is what is historic is not only honoring the land and its biodiversity, but the cultural diversity of indigenous peoples and the many, many groups in the Amazon with their language and their rituals and their traditions and their religious beliefs, which have to be honored and respected. And that the church needs to be stewards of the land with them and stewards of these guardians of the forest and so on. So the need to protect them is more crucial than ever because many are dying and for their strong protection of the forest. So this is historic in so many ways.
Wonderful.
And it marks the occasion where two issues flow together, and we find leaders in the world community, especially Pope Francis, to come forward. We find the kind of leadership on these issues that is lacking in some other countries. So the two issues that are obvious, and Mary Evelyn has mentioned them, the environmental attention to environmental emergencies and crises, and also the voice of indigenous peoples, which is the focus of my studies among North American peoples, especially Native American peoples. And in this sense, it's very interesting to see that Thomas Berry also was very prescient about the confluence of these issues, environmental concerns and the voice of indigenous peoples. And we find it also in the encyclical by Pope Francis, Laudato Si, where he emphasizes the special role of indigenous people. And quite often that's romanticized, that native people living close to the natural world have some kind of special wisdom just by virtue of being indigenous. But the reality is these are people who have lived often in that bioregion for hundreds, if not thousands of years. And they have come to an in-depth and a wisdom understanding of the local life in the region.
Right.
So their sense of biodiversity is being lifted up at the Synod. So the sense of the sovereign voice of native peoples and the pressures on the earth community, they are flowing into this conference in a way that we so need this leadership at this time.
Great. Thank you for that insight. With that said, of course, this synod is not only concerned about ecology and environmental issues. It's also concerned about the new path for the church in the Amazonia region and also in our universal church. This may be a little bit sensitive, but it's a issue on the table already to ordain viri probati for the remote regions, for the lay faithful to receive communion on a regular basis, and even to promote the role and influence of women, not only in this region, but also in our entire universal church.
Excellent.
So I, of course, am a priest, so-called clergy. But at the same time, I saw a lot of lay faithful, especially women, really dedicating themselves for the mission, pastoral care, service of the church. But at the same time, many places we also have suffered to a great extent from clericalism. So this synod is hoping to address this issue. What hope do you have for this synod with this regard?
I think that's an excellent point. Yeah. I think what's most important is pastoral care, especially offered with true sincerity and humility. I think we must, though, really respect the beliefs of these people. And so what missionizing means, I think, needs to be re-examined, enculturation and so on. But maybe just dialogue, that the church will really learn from the antiquity of beliefs that everything is sacred. We've lost that sense. Yes. And if we don't have a sense of the incarnation in every part of reality, we're missing one of the greatest revelations of Christianity. So I think we can be evangelized, you see, by that sensibility. And that requires deep listening to the rituals and practices and beliefs of indigenous peoples.
So we have a concern to discover in the church now new forms of evangelism. And this evangelism, the good news, we have seen it as a human-centered act that is brought to other humans. And we also have a long-term sense of the human divine character, that the good news is also the bringing of the revelation to other human groups. Yes. But Mary Evelyn's point, and I think what I'm hoping that the Synod would also begin to open up in a creative way, is that the good news is also coming from creation itself. There was in the church in the Middle Ages a very clear understanding of the book of Scripture, and that was lost in the church. We have no good sense of the human-earth relations other than a manipulative relationship. We take the earth and we mold it into all of the things we need. And now we are challenged by the problems, the environmental issues that have come out of that kind of exclusive relationship. It's not that we cannot not use the earth. We will also always have that exchange. But now I think we begin to sense there is an evangelism or good news coming from the earth and from the life biodiversity of the earth itself.
Right.
I want to just make one other point, because this is such an important moment, the Synod. And that is, 2 years ago, I was in Norway for a meeting with the Norwegian government, with the United Nations Development Program, and with the Forum on Religion and Ecology and other religion-oriented groups. The Vatican was represented by Monsignor Sancho Sarando. And what came out of that is an Interfaith Rainforest Initiative, IRI. It's now under the United Nations Environment Program, supported by the Norwegian government, which has been supporting forest protection for a long time. But this new confluence of ecology and NGOs, of governments, and of the United Nations, and of the religious communities, again, to say that the indigenous peoples are the primary guardians of the forest, and we need to support them.
That's great.
It's an extraordinary movement in confluence with the Synod.
As I was listening to your talk, one Chinese expression came to my mind, which means crisis and opportunity come together.
Right.
Also, another expression is similar to this expression, which literally means when crisis comes, it will become a force to push for reform.
Yes.
Mm.
Yes.
Because when we don't have crisis, we feel comfortable.
Right.
We feel everything is secure and normal. And now we are forced to face our reality. It's
Right.
not normal.
Yeah.
It's actually normal for a short period of time. Now we are bearing the heavy consequences.
Right.
So this synod, to a certain degree, is also a result of this crisis.
Yes.
The crisis has maybe slapped our face, and we have to open our eyes and say, oh, we were dreaming. Now the reality is such. We have to address it.
Yes.
But we have to acknowledge it at the same time. Suddenly I thought of this 16-year-old Swedish young girl, Greta Thunberg, an environment activist.
Right.
Now she's going around the world to ask for young people to stand up and ask for change,
Right.
which is a good thing from my perspective, at least.
Yes.
But to my, wonderment, many people don't look at the situation like that. Even some political leaders mocking her
Yes.
and then belittling her as a mentally ill child.
Yeah.
So this is really making me confused. What is going on in our world? Maybe something also related to this synod. As the synod fathers are discussing, discerning what to do with our church with this environmental crisis, some people in our church, in our own church, are trying to deter it,
Right.
to belittle it,
Right. making
it like a heresy.
Right.
So put these two things together. What reflections do you have for this kind of confusing situation?
Well, I think if we first take your point about the church, Laudato Si, Pope Francis, the care for the environment, I have such respect and admiration for Pope Francis, taking the name of St. Francis
Yes.
for the first time in our history. And he's very courageous. But why is it the pushback? I think this is a very important question which we must address. And it's in part because we haven't changed our theology. We haven't come to an eco-theology.
This place hasn't changed.
No, and this heart hasn't changed. Because we still we're going to escape to heaven and everything will be fine. And afterworld.
That's a good point. Yeah.
But our theology, and even as it's taught in seminaries, as you know, that includes Protestant and Catholic seminaries, is not sufficient for this great transformation of our time.
Right.
But it's wonderful that the Pope is so close to the Greek Orthodox patriarch Bartholomew, because Bartholomew, through the Orthodox tradition, has brought forth the sacredness of all creation.
Right.
And he speaks about crimes against creation and ecological sin. And the Pope begins Laudato Si with his reference to this theology.
Right.
So that theology needs to be changed, and soon, rapidly. How can we have incarnation only in a person? It's in the whole universe. The beginning is the Word, the Logos. So that is our central, one of our key moments of change. I don't know if you want to comment on that.
Yes. I think the suffering of Greta Thunberg, as well as her message, comes out of suffering also. She is not someone who is not reflective in this area of pain and the anguish of the world. And so I sense it's very interesting to see her in the forms of psyche, whether it's autism or whatever her psychological disposition is. She's able to distance herself from her pain to some extent, and also from her critics. And those critics, I believe, come out of the troubled times, and largely from people who have vested interest in not changing or not addressing the changes. It's a spectrum there, so we can see it. But just to pick up on the direction Mary Evelyn was going to, I'm very struck by what the historic Jesus tells us about the nature of suffering. And we know that the incarnation in the person of Jesus is also addressing this question of the crucifixion, of suffering, of encounter with the death experience. And yet, we also have in John's Gospel the sense of a cosmic Christ, or the Logos, the sense of a patterning within the universe itself. And the Christian tradition has transmitted in its good news message both of those reality. And now I find myself, along with these powerful insights of the Christian community with regard to the historic Jesus and the cosmic Christ and the sense of the Trinitarian mystery that pervades reality, that there is also a deep prayer that I feel at times to the sense of the Mother of God,
right.
The sense of Mary as the world or the prism through which the white light of Christ comes in the many colors of reality. So there is this rich tradition that we share, and that it speaks to the travail and the search of the human, and it speaks to us in our times now too, if we allow it.
Great.
I think that's a wonderful point, and I'd just like to pick up, because we know we do have this problem of women in the church and clericalism and so on, but I want to come back to this. Why is it that the devotion to Mary is still very strong?
Yes, that's
this
true.
Tremendous sense of the feminine as containing a divine presence, as holding it, as birthing it, and so on. We absolutely must come back and respect that sensibility in all women, of this feminine part of creation. And that's why Greta, it does become this lightning rod, right?
Yes, correct.
And it is... I share your sense of wonderment and disbelief that people would criticize her. But I think she is truly a pure soul. Her directness, her words, her sincerity, her authenticity come forward in a way that's so startling. Everyone who hears her understands. And so people who are malicious and twisted want to criticize that purity of heart. But believe me, that purity of heart is what is going to win the day, because I think, and I'm sure you would share this, that the young people, their strikes, their actions, their protests are perhaps one of the most important signs that the next generation is standing up for life, and life is sacred, and life is something to be protected.
Maybe using Father Ted Deschanet's idea, this is part of the evolutionary journey.
Yes.
Now they have come to this point to better understand the world, the universe, the sacredness of our human society and the environment. They have gone much farther than the last generation and even our old generation. And for this, I feel optimistic.
Totally.
And there is this sense, when Mary Evelyn and I met over Sanskrit, when she was studying, one of the terms that we would think about at times is this really interesting term, chakravartin, a world turner. When the world turns and we begin to feel things have suddenly changed.
Yes.
And I would, although it was a South Asian or Indian term in Sanskrit, I would think sometimes when I studied about Francis of Assisi, that St. Francis was a world turner.
Yes.
And this little Poverello, this little poor man in the north of Italy, who had a new vision, or a vision of contemplation, and also a vision of the society of the times. And he turned the world in the formation of the Franciscan and his ideas. And I would think to myself, wouldn't it be marvelous to live during the time of such a person and to see all of that happen? And suddenly it strikes me in the face, it's like that slap you mentioned, where here's this young girl from Sweden, and she's turning the world.
Yes.
And she's making something apparent to all of us.
Lovely. That's lovely. Well, of course, our conversation can go on until, I don't know, tomorrow, but one thing I really want to get into it is your specialty, Mary Evelyn. You are an expert on Confucianism. Confucianism is, of course, a legacy from China. And you, from America, studied Confucianism and became an expert. Now, from Matteo Ricci's time, throughout the past 400 years, even now, we still have this struggle how to integrate Christianity and Chinese traditional culture, including Confucianism, Taoism. Now we are talking about interreligious dialogue. Now we are talking about a community of a shared future for all humankind.
Mm-hmm.
From your scholarly perspective, what both the Catholic Church and Chinese society can do to put these two great thoughts or philosophy or ideas together to make this shared future of all humanity happen?
Mm-hmm. Well, it's a wonderful question. I have to just say first, though, an expert is a very strong word. So I am a student of a very ancient and complex tradition, of course, in one of the most literate cultures in the world. So I take a small place in a lineage of my teachers, like Ted DeBerry at Columbia, Thomas Berry, and so on, who studied and passed on the tradition. So I feel very grateful for that. And I think the first thing I would say is we have to study each of these traditions on their own. If we start being comparative right away, we're missing the depth of the tradition.
Okay.
So everyone, I think, in seminary or college, even high school, we should have classes on world religions.
On world religions.
We used to teach this all the time, just a basic introductory class on world religion. And students loved it because in our world, it's the literacy, cultural literacy that we need. So that's the beginning, I think. Read Confucius, read Mencius, read Zhu Xi, read Wang Yangming. You don't have to read everything, but just get the overview of the tradition.
Right.
And also, the second point would be all of these traditions change over time. So we have classical Confucianism, we have Han Confucianism when it becomes a state force. We have Sung Confucianism with its philosophy and so on, and Ming. And then we have the downfall, in a way, of Confucius in its modern period under Mao. But we have the revival with great scholars who kept this alive. And right now in China, a revival of Confucianism being taught in the schools. So we have to see the overview of the changes. And then the third point would be we have to enter into the traditions as dynamic wisdom traditions for the present. Right. So what is it that we can glean and take forward when we have studied the texts and the history for the present day?
Right.
And to say that Confucianism, for example, is one of the richest traditions for the unity of cosmos, earth, and humans. You know, that idea alone, Tenren Hui, the heaven, earth, and human are one, is absolutely central. And the most famous phrase in Confucianism might be Changsai's Western inscription.
Yes.
A metaphor. But heaven is my father, earth is my mother, and such a small person as I has a place in their midst. This influenced Journey of the Universe. You see, our film and so on. Teilhard influenced it, but so did Confucian thought.
Right.
So if we go to Christianity, unless you want to make a point there, but on the relationship, is that okay?
Please.
Okay. So I think dialogue, again, can only take place if we really know the traditions.
Right, right.
And, of course, there's deep knowledge and there's sufficient knowledge. But if we're going to say, how are these traditions compatible? How can they be complementary? How can they be in dialogue rather than just their differences? And I would take the notion of compassion, of love, as a central gift of both of these traditions. The Christian virtue of love is one of the most influential ideas in world history, because you love everyone. The Confucian idea of ren, humaneness, you begin with your family. You extend it to friends and society. And then the nature, politics and nature in the whole world. So it's a different model, but it's a profound sense of human compassion in relation to the whole cosmos. The creativity of the cosmos is a compassionate entity. So I think the possibilities for dialogue are opening up in
Exactly.
new ways.
Exactly. Yeah. Maybe we have to first learn from each other
Yes.
before we start our conversation.
Exactly.
Otherwise, the conversation may go wrong and
Yes.
stop in the middle.
Yes,
Okay.
exactly.
Now, can you say a little bit more about your American Theater Association's, events and even some of the great
Yes.
figures involved with you on this theater association?
Yes.
Like Sister Ilia Delio, Sister
Kathleen Duffy.
Duffy.
Excellent.
And
some
meet
younger.
them, I never met them.
Yeah.
How much you come together to form ideas and work for a project?
So I think what we've been trying to do for the past 40 years with the Teilhard Association is we have an annual meeting where we have a major speaker like Ursula King and so on. We also have publications of small brochures and then a perspective that shares information. And then we have a website that we've created.
Yes.
So all of this is to get his message out further.
Wonderful.
But again, Thomas wanted him to be seen as a great fountainhead, but something that could be developed in different directions.
Sure, that's for sure. Just to let you know that here in China, we have also a theater friendship community.
Wonderful.
Wonderful.
We have, organized 5 conferences on theater. This year, on October the 26th, we will have the 6th theater conference. And we are asking people from different fields, science, philosophy, language, to give talks and share their ideas.
That's wonderful.
We hope that someday American Theater Association and the Chinese Theater Friendship Community can join our hands.
That's a great idea.
These great figures' ideas, and even Thomas Berry
Yes.
will enrich us in a different way.
Yes.
So it's our sincere hope, and also I pray for this day to come earlier.
Yes.
So today is a wonderful opportunity that we can at least on this small scale to share the same vision, same idea. And for this, I want to, on behalf of our viewers, our staff members, to thank you for this opportunity you gave us.
Thank you.
And we really look forward to further cooperation and the best wish for your continuing research, publication, and other activities. Thank you very much.
Thank you for your good
And
English,
John,
too.
Thank you
we
so
really
much.
hope to
Yeah.
have better opportunities in the future.
Good.
Okay?
Thank you.
Good.
Thank you so
God
much.
bless.
God bless. Thank you so much.